It's an old art form of microphone wrestling. It's an old sport brought up during the Marconi days. It hasn't progressed much. But anyway, my name is Paul Newman, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this first in our series of Inspiring Speakers for Social Change. That's not the name of the series. We don't really have a name for it. But we'll be letting you know via our new website, which is so new that it's still under construction. But it's called whatelycivic.org. I don't know who came up with that, but I thought it was a very clever name. So we're going to go with that and keep checking back, because we have a couple of speakers in the next month who may or may not be on the date you see advertised at the moment. That's subject to change. They will be here, but we're still trying to figure out exactly when. But meanwhile, I have to figure out how to work the website so I can change these things. But that'll happen. I'm very excited to have Bill Newman here with us tonight. I'm very excited to having you all with us. And I'd like for the Whately Civic Association to identify themselves, or just raise their hand if you, so you can look around and see the people that are making this possible are raising their hand. And one of our tenets is that we believe that strong communities are created by people talking to each other in a civil discourse fashion. And that makes everybody better off in a small town. And if more small towns do that, then we end up with a better, stronger county. And if counties do it, we end up with a stronger state. And if states do it, lo and behold, we may end up with a better, stronger country, and a more democratic one. So that's our hope. Also, these talks feature an expert in a field, and there are many fields that we're trying to bring before you to explain how the Trump administration is impacting their function and their missions. This one tonight will be primarily on the legal judicial system, and I'm sure all of you know that's under, well, I won't qualify it by saying anything derogatory. So I'll just let Bill do his spiel. I will say one thing, one of my mantras, which I always love repeating because I was an academic once, is that the best defense against tyranny is a well-educated public. So this is part of our effort to create and help improve the education of our public. And if we all get out and speak to each other, having been educated, this would be a much nicer situation to be in than the one we find ourselves in right now. There are materials outside. Here's a little handbook with some nifty articles, one of which is called the Declaration of Independence, but there's more. There's part of the Constitution. And let me see. I made notes to protect myself from wandering. So, okay. Oh yes, so I wanted to introduce Bill, who, by the way, is an attorney in Northampton, has a practice there and has had one for 40 years. Is that correct, Bill?
40?
40, 30, maybe?
No, it's more than 40.
More than 40. You don't look a day over 40 to me, but okay, that's fine. And also, he has a radio show, Talk the Town. Is that it? Talk the Talk. Sorry, I was on it last week, I should know. And many of you no doubt heard me, that's why you're here, right? Wrong. Okay, anyway, it's a great show, and it tackles current events and all sorts of civil justice, liberty issues that affect our local community, and I think it's a real boon to the community to have Bill do his show, co-host his show, and it's a real asset in talking about education and informing us of what's going on and what to do about it, which he will do tonight as well. And in order to introduce him, I want to first quote, make a quote that the last time this quote was uttered was January 20th, 2025. And the quote goes as follows. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Sorry, I got choked up with this. Anyway, Bill, if you were to evaluate that last sentence, what kind of feedback would you give the person who said it? Do you mind coming up and taking over?
Yeah. Well, being here and being in a democratic forum, let's vote. Why don't you're the moderator. Okay, I'll act as moderator. Those who think he's doing a good job at fulfilling those words, please raise your hand. Those who would say he's not, please raise your hand.
That's the visibility.
Okay, so where that comes from is Article 2 of the Constitution. The Constitution begins, obviously, with Article 1, which sets forth the legislative powers. Article 2 sets forth the executive powers. Article 3 sets forth the judicial powers. That's the structure of the first three articles of the Constitution. And indeed, in the first section of Article 2, it has that exact oath that it says, before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, there's a caveat, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. There's some other parts of Article 2 that I think, as long as Paul has brought up Article 2, I think we want to pause to reflect on tonight. The first section says, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. It's called the vesting clause, and there's one of these for both the judiciary and the executive branch and the legislative branch. This vesting clause is what we're talking about significantly when Trump says, I have the power to do this, and I am the executive, and the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in a president, which it does, and it does say that. There's some other parts of this first section of Article 2. It says this. There's just some parts that you might want to reflect on as we're talking with each other tonight. The President shall, at stated times, receive for his services a compensation, which shall be neither increased nor diminished during the period for which he's been elected. And he shall not receive within that period any other emolument. I just work here. I'm just reading it. I swear, I'm not making it up. Any other emolument from the United States or any of them. Then there's another part that I think is worthy of some reflection. And it says, among his powers, he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And this, the final section of Article 2. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall not be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. I'm sorry, I think I mangled it. Shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. High crimes and misdemeanors, as you probably know, does not mean high crimes and misdemeanors as we think of that phrase today. It was actually a term of art at the time the Constitution was adopted, meaning offenses against the country and the fabric of the country. That's what a high crime and misdemeanor means in this context. I must say, it just struck me as I was reading the part about reprieves and pardons. One of the most emotional phone calls I'd ever received was from the office of the U.S. Pardon Attorney. And it was during the Obama administration. I'd been involved with Buzz Eisenberg in what was called CP 2014, Clemency Project 2014, and we'd filed a number of petitions for persons who were serving really long sentences on drug charges. And I got this call, and I was told that there was a lawyer on the phone from the pardon office, and I figured, now they were calling, they wanted more information, or there was a comma in the wrong place, or whatever it was. And I picked up the phone and said, hi, and the woman on the other end said, is this Mr. Newman? I said, yes, it is, and do you represent? And she stated his name, and I said, I do. And she said, well, I'm calling to tell you that the president has just granted your petition for commutation. And it was breaking out crying, you know, on the phone with somebody you've never met. A bad idea, I think, but boy, was I choked up. And I have to say that when I see how essentially pardons are for sale, it so cheapens. Not that Trump was the first, but he has taken it to a whole other level. And for me, to have that moment and those petitions that were granted cheapened by this use of pardons for overt or political purposes, to me is really, really frustrating and I think maddening. Let's talk. I want to say tonight one preliminary word, if I might, that I'm not speaking on or behalf of or as a representative of any organization tonight. What I am sharing with you are my thoughts and analysis. I'll talk total, I think, for about a half an hour, maybe a little less, I hope, and we'll spend the other half hour that we have together with a Q&A and having your thoughts and reflections as well. The question before us, based on the Democratic vote that we just held, was how we can combat the rise of and implementation of authoritarianism in the United States. Let's be clear about this. If the answer were self-evident, we wouldn't need to be here. In order to appreciate how much has changed and how rapidly our political and social and cultural and educational lives have been altered, we need to really take a look at the last 8+ months. Change and the rate of change has changed. Many people predicted that some of the things that have happened would happen, but I would defy you to tell me who of any national import or with a national podium or microphone said what we have seen would happen. So, it struck me as I was beginning to prepare these remarks last week, and I came back to it again yesterday and today, and I was struck by how much has happened in a week. So when I started sketching out these remarks, there hadn't been any troops sent to Portland to combat an invasion that hasn't happened and won't happen. And before that, of course, that was before the National Guard was federalized. Another part of Article 2, which we should look at. Of course, those orders regarding federal troops and the federalization of the National Guards came on the heels of troops being deployed in the District of Columbia and Los Angeles. Also in the past few days, former FBI Director James Comey has been indicted. And the President has issued an executive order, demanding really the investigation of nonprofits that might fund projects that the President personally does not favor, looking at criminal as well as civil penalties. And just a week ago, the firing of Jimmy Kimmel was just beginning to play out, and persons who had criticized the positions, not the person, the positions espoused by Charlie Kirk had just begun to be fired from their jobs. And let me make clear, in case this ever gets beyond this room, and even if it didn't, I absolutely abhor political violence. Assassination is completely and utterly unacceptable. Murder is unacceptable, and this was a blatant murder, and my heart does go out to his family and loved ones. That said, the positions that he espoused should be something he would want us to talk about, don't you think? There are some other things that have come to light in the last few days, including the deplorable conditions and facilities that migrants are being thrown into. It was not as widely known a week ago. And the targeting of journalists was only beginning to bubble into public consciousness, although that has been going on for a long time. The tipping point for when an ostensibly free country becomes an authoritarian regime can be unclear. A country can be in the middle of it and not know it's in the middle of it, not until some time has passed. Certainly the government's not going to announce it. To the extent that an accusation is made, the government will deny it. And that transformation often does not happen with a single stroke, rarely happens with a single incident or event, but rather it's an amalgam of policies and events that come together, and at some point the populace arises, or at least wakes up, to say, where did our freedoms go? So, what are those events? And the answer is, there's no specific list, but I have sketched out one list that has a lot of those elements. I'd suggest they consist of troops on the street, a leader with total control of his political party. That leader would encourage and does encourage violence and brooks no dissent. The government often initiates a war on experts and scientists and lawyers and judges and others who might not support the government for a variety of reasons. But they come under the same umbrella, which is not for us, and therefore an enemy. There often is a war on freedom of the press and journalists, a war against free speech in many forms. Book banning begins. The leader assumes control of the nation's educational systems and universities and cultural centers and museums. Labor unions, effectively, are disassembled. Minority groups are demonized and targeted. Persons are snatched off the street and disappeared. There often is a secret police that operate in secret. Government positions and favors are for sale. Oligarchs are put in charge. The autocrat is a master propagandist. His messages and his visage are everywhere, omnipresent, all the time. Disinformation is rampant. Jingoism becomes the norm. The great leader and his government rewrite the nation's history. He rules by fear. Opposition parties are weak. Opposition in general is weak and often afraid. Opposition party leaders and others who criticize or have criticized the leader face imprisonment. Executive power is consolidated, often with the justification, might I suggest the guise, of emergencies. The national legislature neuters itself and transfers power to him. The judiciary also gets in line. Courts will function because that veneer of normalcy and respectability is useful. But the judiciary will, as a practical matter, do the leader's bidding. Democratic norms first are ignored and then are eviscerated. Belief in public institutions erode. Elections, if held, have, generally speaking, predetermined results. The armed forces are politicized, and truth and facts become whatever the leader and his government say they are. Where our country is today checks many of these boxes and many other indicia of authoritarianism. This is not going to be a total downer. I hesitate I hesitated to do that list because it depressed me when I read it before I got here. But I'm quite serious. I'm going to make some suggestions on what we should, can, and I think will do. So let's go back to what we were all taught about our government when we were in school, starting in grade school, that we have these three co-equal branches of government, and that the separation of powers set forth in the Constitution in Article 1, regarding the legislative branch, in Article 2, the executive branch, and Article 3, the judicial branch, that this separation of powers set forth in the Constitution theoretically prevents the rise of a king-like potentate. But the historical fact of a republic, which over time has become more democratic, does not guarantee a future of democracy. And I'd point out, if you look at the amendments to the Constitution that have occurred, and there's a article in the last few days by Jill Lepore about how we do not really have a mechanism for amending the Constitution that's very effective. It suggests it's really worth reading. That what you find in the amendments to the Constitution is an expansion, many times, of the right to vote. There was a civil war over slavery. There have been essentially progressive amendments, alterations of our foundational document, which indicates the arc of history is long, and it hasn't always been a smooth ride or a continual progression, but the country has moved towards democracy. Doesn't guarantee more of that in the future. So, you look at countries where democracy at a republic has been lost, and you think about Hungary and Viktor Orban, and Turkey and President Erdogan, and you reflect on Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and you think about the Philippines, and even the short-lived democratic reforms in Russia and their evisceration under Vladimir Putin, and of course the demise of democracy in Germany and the rise of Hitler in the 1930s, and of course Mussolini in Italy as well. All of these examples conjure the wisdom attributed to Benjamin Franklin, who, when asked after the Constitutional Convention of 1787 what kind of a government the founders had created, said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Now, we've kept it to this point. I'm not in any way claiming it's been perfect. It's far from that. But it has been a republic that has moved in more democratic ways. I think it's appropriate at this point to share with you a New York Times piece that was published today. I don't know if any of you have seen it, titled "The Man Behind the All-Powerful Presidency." It'll be assumed in the physical paper tomorrow. The story is about a man named Russell Vought, spelled V-O-U-G-H-T, pronounced Vogt, who is the budget director. Sounds kind of like a not very, well, important but not consequential position, but it is very much that. What Mr. Vogt believes, as the Supreme Court indicates it believes, is that the president should have almost, and I'm not sure that qualification is necessary, complete power over the executive branch. And that was what I quoted to you before, that the executive power of the United States shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. It does not say that that power is subject to laws that might create independent executive branch agencies. Now, the Supreme Court and the Congress have thought it meant that for the last 150 years. The country functions on that basis, but there is a strong indication that this Supreme Court may well undo all of that law, all of that precedent, all of that history, because as we know from its immunity decision, it really believes in a really strong president, not subject to all sorts of strictures that we used to believe were part of the norm of a presidency. Now, according to Mr. Vogt and Mr. Trump, what this investment clause means is that, among other things, is that the executive branch agencies that have operated in accordance with the legislation that created them, signed by the House and the Senate, passed by the House and the Senate, signed by the President, and implemented for well over a century, that autonomy that some of those agencies have, that should be thrown out and eviscerated, and Donald Trump should be given control of all of it. We're talking about the president having control over the Federal Reserve, which actually is the most difficult one to do because of the specific language that's used in the legislation that created it. We're also talking, of course, about the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA and Social Security and the Department of the Treasury and, of course, the Justice Department and the Internal Revenue Service, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, one place that you can see this playing out is in immigration. So, immigration enforcement is part of the executive branch. The legislature creates the laws, the executive branch implements them. That's the theory. So we have a lot of judicial, quasi-judicial fora in those agencies. Social Security, if you have a Social Security dispute, you could go to a Social Security hearing officer, and eventually you'll go to a Social Security court. Immigration works the same way. Donald Trump says, here's my order about how persons who are apprehended, detained, taken into custody by ICE, this is how this is how the system shall work. And he says, and I can dictate that. This unitary executive theory was a theory. It was kind of floated a little bit when John Roberts worked for the Reagan White House. It is now something that has moved into a kind of mainstream judicial philosophy. Only because, not because the mainstream has moved, but because the entire philosophy of the Supreme Court has changed. What's happened? The founders believed that Congress would, of course, jealously defend its prerogatives and power. The founders, in my judgment, did not envision Congress, or any Congress, that would willingly make itself subservient to the executive branch, that would give up its authority. Such complicity, I'd suggest, was virtually unimaginable. This is an analogy that makes me uncomfortable in some ways, but there is a historic accuracy here that I think we should note, and it's not the only place or the only country where this has happened. But the Reichstag, the parliament in Germany in 1933, passed what was called the enabling law that allowed Hitler to bypass the normal course of passing laws and declare laws as he wished them to be. In other words, the Congress gave, its Congress, the parliament, the Reichstag, gave up its power. Congress, the Congress of the United States, has a lot of power set forth in the Constitution. Among those powers, this power, it's the first statement in the section on the Article 1, Section 8, which talks about the powers of Congress, and it says, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. Duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. 2 short sentences later, and to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. And sometime later, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. The legislative branch giving up its authority is of enormous consequence. The fact that the Congress essentially has been supine in the last 8 months is deeply disturbing. There's, based on a quick survey, a number of you who will remember Watergate, okay? Now, Watergate was, of course, this turning point. Not that anything is permanent, but it was a turning point in our history in which the Supreme Court and the Congress all did their job, and President Nixon ultimately resigned rather than being found guilty of the impeachment that he was facing. And after Nixon, the powers of Congress were enhanced by legislation because there was some view that Constitution should be clarified in some ways with regard to, among specifically, the power to appropriate money. Because it is the power to appropriate money that is the linchpin of Congress's authority to tell the executive branch what to do. The executive branch doesn't have the money, as we may find out tomorrow. Nothing happens. That was a bad sentence. A lot happens, but it is that power of the purse on which Congress's power really hinges. So, what happened after Nixon was that in 1974, Congress passed, and the President signed, the Impoundment Control Act, of 1974, which said, in essence, what was happening under Nixon, which was, he's only a couple times, impounded funds that had been appropriated by Congress for specific purposes and didn't spend it, and the Impoundment Control Act says you have to spend it. So, what Mr. Trump and Mr. Vogt say in response to that legislation, that law, that the executive branch has to spend the money as Congress has directed, is that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. It infringes on the power of the president and therefore should be declared null and void. And that money is appropriated by Congress. The president will decide, and the president alone will decide whether it is spent. Again, where are those congressional representatives, those Republican senators and congressional representatives saying, that's outrageous? The silence is deafening. Now, as for the Supreme Court, this is a little tricky. I'll take a 30-second detour because it's at least reasonably relevant, and it's also one of the saddest moments in my legal career, so let me share it. I had finished an argument at the Massachusetts Appeals Court in a case that was not of great significance to anyone other than the person involved. And after it, a number of lawyers came up and said, "What a great argument, you clearly won, you have the precedent on your side, you have the law on your side, the questions were great, blah, blah, blah." And, oh, these are lawyers I didn't know, and I went home and thought, wow, that's really great. And then I got a decision from the Massachusetts Appeals Court that said, you lose. You lose because what we have here is a somewhat informal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And I said, what? no, I can't tell you what I really said, but I said really, somewhat informal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. All of this is to say that predicting appellate decisions is not a science. It's a lot of projection. It's a lot of guesswork. Although, given the issues, you can have a pretty clear idea at this point how the justices think. I want to talk a bit about the birthright citizenship case, which is coming up, will be coming up before the court, because I think it's really illustrative. We should note that this court has blessed horrifying and undemocratic partisan gerrymandering, saying, federal courts can't do anything about it, it's pretty complicated, so we're not going to give that power to the courts. They made that decision. It's also, in effect, gutted at least half of the Voting Rights Act. And in a case last term, there was a decision that said, well, gerrymandering that is based on race isn't a violation of the Voting Rights Act. However, we're going to give all of those elected officials a presumption of regularity and good faith, and although the evidence was really quite overwhelming, it wasn't overwhelming enough. And therefore, they instructed that as long as the politicians say, we're doing this for the purpose of rigging the election, but not because we're motivated by race, that'll be fine. It's a slight oversimplification, but not much. Now, yes, it does say overt racial gerrymandering is still illegal. But again, if you just say, hey, we did it for the purpose of making the election come out the way we wanted, it was for political purposes, not for racially discriminatory purposes, the Supreme Court says, fine. And of course, a lot of this needs to be put in the context of the Supreme Court having decided that for criminal acts that President Trump engaged in, he was immune. And future presidents, of course, will be immune as well. Now, I said before I did not want to be a complete bummer, and I still don't want to be. Okay, you've waited long enough. A couple of things. I think we should turn to Harvard political scientist Erica Chenoweth. How many people have heard of her? Right, that's a pretty good representation. So, Professor Chenoweth, and I have read her book. Or most of it. It's not an easy read, but it's really fascinating. And her premise is that she looks at the history and says, for authoritarian regimes to fall, if you have 3.5% of the population regularly engaged in protest, the regime falls. But it is a large number, and it is over a protracted period of time. We're talking a year, two, maybe more. The regime will fall. And nonviolence is the essence of it. Because you know what she says? If it becomes violent, the regime has the guns and the power and the judiciary and the courts and the jails. Nonviolence is the essence of it. It also grants moral authority to those who protest. And she cites the many times that those popular uprisings have succeeded. And so you say, well, that doesn't sound so hard. 3.5% of the population of the United States is about 12 million people. That's more, I believe, but it's close, depending on the estimates, of how many people were out in the streets for No King's Day the first time. But it's a huge effort. And people have said, in the talks I've given recently, well, what about these standouts we're doing? What about our protests? It seems, we get honked horns and that sort of recognition, but does it matter? And the answer to that is yes. Every one of them matters. Every day it matters. Now, I point out that as Professor Chenoweth, who's been in the Valley a couple of times speaking, and next time she's here, do yourself a favor, go hear her. She takes this pretty dry statistical information and she makes it real and vivid and interesting. Really, she's quite terrific. So the 3.5%, as you would say, it's not a guarantee, it's a historical analysis, but it is a really good place to start. So, can we get to that tipping point? And I think the answer is that answer will come. There are a couple of other reasons that we should have cause, I wouldn't say for optimism, but I would say for a passionate belief that we can stop what is happening. One reason is that I think, I am trying to be careful on how to say this, not for fear of offending someone, because I really would like to be accurate. I believe there will be some victories in the courts. There will be some losses. But the courts, I think, the Supreme Court, and most of the cases that are pending have not gotten to the Supreme Court for a full decision. Some have gotten there on the shadow docket, and they've refused the injunctions, and they'll say, well, we'll decide it later on. And sure, there can be a total destruction of various federal agencies and programs and policies while the litigation goes on. All that is true, but the Supreme Court did not box itself in to a decision, which maybe Chief Justice Roberts, who is in fact an institutionalist and cares about the reputation of the court, maybe he didn't want those decisions to come out now. It gets to let me just mention two other parts of this, and I'll get back to the courts. They're members of the military who will take their oaths very seriously, and it is certainly possible that some Republican congressional representatives will in fact refuse at some point to be a sycophant for Trump because he can't guarantee their jobs anymore. And that's what this is about. If they don't do what he says, he's going to take them on in a primary, but maybe that will not matter 2, 3, 6 months from now or in the election itself of 2026. So, I'd like to conclude, and then we'll have some questions and answers, with two quotes, one story and a quote. I'm going to try this again on the basis of my informal survey of the age of this crowd. Right? How many of you remember a man named A.J. Musty? Okay. So A.J. Musty, right? I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I've been pronouncing it wrong for a long time. If I am, I'm sorry. So a lifelong pacifist. And during the Vietnam War, he stood in front of the White House night after night, often alone, holding a lighted candle. And one dark and pretty dreary night, a reporter came up to him and asked if he thought that his protest would likely change the country's policies. And he said, I don't do this to change the country's policies. I do it so that the country won't change me. I think that lesson applies today, because how long it will be to live through the ways in which our freedoms and democracy and things we hold dear are being challenged, are being wrecked, are being destroyed. How long will it take to live through that, and what will it take to rebuild that society afterwards? I can't even begin to predict. But I do think that if we stand together and if we're here for each other, we can do the work that needs to be done. We can do, starting with the standouts in our local towns, to giving our efforts and financial support where it can do the most good, to simply saying no. What the tipping point will be, what will change this with the elections of 2026, could that be really helpful? Yeah. Could it be disastrous? Yeah. But we're not going to give up. And so it's time to, I think, to put our heads down and work harder. I said there was a quote that I wanted to share, and there is. And this is a quote from Bobby Kennedy. That would be the good Bobby Kennedy. He gave a very memorable oration in 1966 at the University of Cape Town. He used the word man. I think if he had lived a few more years, he would have said person in this quote, but here's how he said it. Every time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sets forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Now, there's one final, much more pedestrian view of this. And it really comes from the syndicated columnist Peter Dunn in 1901, who had a character in his strip, Mr. Dooley. And Mr. Dooley, I'll forget the long setup, says in essence, the Supreme Court follows the election returns. This Supreme Court is not immune to public opinion. This Supreme Court will know if and when there is a sea change in this country's view of what is acceptable and what is not. And although you can't measure it, that is also part of the tipping point that I think will happen as our resistance succeeds. Thank you all so very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Test. Any questions out there for Bill?
I'd like to follow up on this last point you're making, a hopeful one, but first I have to ask the question, what makes you think there are going to be elections?
There's one in every crowd, you know. Okay, so the governor of California has, I think, done something that is extremely significant. He has articulated exactly what is on the mind of those who most fear Donald Trump, which is that there may well not be a presidential election in 2028. And the first answer to that is, how could that possibly happen? He can't run. It's really clear. It could not be clearer in the amendment that sets the maximum presidential term as 2. It's not subject to debate. But maybe it is. Maybe he could get away with it. There's no way to say how that could happen legally because it can't happen legally. On the other hand, you would think that it would be impossible for people to come to Washington, engage in an insurrection, almost hold the office of president hostage, be convicted of all sorts of violent crimes, and then be pardoned. So I'm not 100% confident that there will be an election. But I do think that the Republicans are sufficiently concerned about their own jobs that unless they think that this extraordinary development could go forward or should go forward, they're going to look really long and hard at their own self-interest. And I think their own self-interest is dictated by the fact that the American people wouldn't stand for it. There's a line beyond which even Trump, who, as he said, could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue and my supporters wouldn't care. He said that. A lot of people said, well, that's just the dumbest thing I ever heard, except it turns out it's correct. So the answer to your question is, I hope it's not a foolish belief, but I do believe it is. And I think that when any kind of noise is made in that direction, it is important to drown it out with, I don't want to say that, it's important to refute it with the reasons why it can't and shouldn't happen. It is, I think, one of the distractions that Trump uses to get people's attention away from the things he doesn't want us to look at. So I'll come back to him in just a second, but for example, probably haven't heard about, you'll recall this name, it was big news. God, it seems a small eternity ago. Jeffrey Epstein, right? An awful lot has happened since Jeffrey Epstein was about to be front page news, and then it went away, and it may continue to disappear. And all sorts of things that Trump has said and done in the intervening weeks goes to a really concerted effort to make sure that that issue does not come up again. It's pretty interesting. He's the only one who knows what's in those files, and he's really adamant he doesn't want us to know. I didn't care, but now that Trump really doesn't want us to know what's there, I think we should all find out. So I think that this 2028 no election, or I can run for a third term, I think it's one of those distractions for the most part. But never say never, because what my colleagues and I talk about a lot is when we get questions from people about, can I do this, should I do that? And the answer is, we don't know. Because the answers we would have given you a year ago may not apply. So I hope that equivocation doesn't sound too much like I'm running for an office.
I was actually referring to the midterm.
Oh, the midterms. I think the midterms are going to happen. He's committed to fixing the midterms. I don't mean remedying the midterms. I mean fixing the midterms by having the gerrymandering go forward. And he's got 5 or 6 seats in Texas. He's going to have some in Nebraska, South, and other states as well, Missouri. And I think he counts the votes and said we can be certain, from his point of view, that the Republicans will maintain the majority in the House of Representatives. I do not think that's a given. I think that there certainly could be a tsunami against this totalitarianism that he has imposed, and that the Republicans could not maintain control of the House. And if they don't maintain control of the House, then at least presumably they don't have control of the purse, they don't have control of the money, and it will be possible to stop Trump after an enormous amount of damage will have been done. Look, it's really, you can blow up a building in a nanosecond. It takes decades to build it. USAID is one example. Decades to create that infrastructure, to save people's lives, to save kids' lives, to give them the medicines they need. Look how quickly he could destroy it. So.
Oh, we have a question
Bill?
over there.
It seems to me that the most immediately impactful resistance work right now is being done by lawyers and lower court judges. Is there any way that ordinary people can contribute to that effort, help the lawyers out? Do you know of?
Well, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't say that there's every one of those organizations would be happy to have your contribution, your financial
I was
contribution.
going to say other than money, because I
Okay.
know about the money part, but yeah.
So that's a really difficult question for which I do not have a good answer. I do think the protests matter. I do think that the judges reading about the protests matter. I think that Congress having to debate these matters matters. All of it will come together at some point. But again, as I said, what that tipping point is, what you can do to influence the outcome of a case, if you're not involved, you can certainly bear witness. You can go to the court. You can stand outside the court. You can write about what is happening in the courts. You can comment on them. You can podcast about them. You can use social media. I mean, there's lots that can be done, but to actually influence the decision itself, I don't think there is an easy, lawful way for that to happen. I wish I could tell you differently, but I think you have to work around it, not directly on it. You can't go call up the judge and say, hey, you know,
Or
this
support the
matters.
lawyers,
I'm sorry?
I think support the lawyers and some.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll tell you, it reminds me some of, this, I'm about to tell you, it doesn't happen very often, but it really comes from the same place where what your local elected representatives will tell you is that when people call up and thank them for doing something, it really matters. And yeah, it does, it does. And so, in the same way, you want to support the lawyers? You know, write them a couple sentences and send it off to their office and say thank you. That matters. That's what gets them up in the morning. It gets them to against really difficult odds sometimes, take on what seems to be impossible. And I point out that when Brown versus the Board of Education was filed with the Supreme Court, the view was it would lose.
What's that?
The view was the case would lose. Brown versus the board, which eventually came out obviously in favor of the children and in favor of the demise of separate but equal, was not viewed as a winner when it got to the court. So things happen. Unexpected things happen. Sometimes they happen for the good.
Hi, Bill.
Hi.
This is not a question, but I guess an announcement that No Kings 2 on October 18th, there's a march starting at Energy Park in Greenfield at 2 o'clock, going to Town Hall. Last time we thought there'd be about 250 people, and there were close to 3,000. So we can do that, and we can do better the next time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sort of following up on the election question, and something that I felt has been sort of missing, and I thought would be like, you know, the first order of business coming up is the midterms and all hands on deck. I mean, you know, personally don't have a lot of faith in our political system, but I think it's what we got and what we got to work with at this point in time. And do you have any thoughts on what we can do to sort of really bring out the vote and turn things around? I mean, I think that's our first line of defense here in terms of, as you mentioned, changing the, makeup of the, House of Representatives or the Senate or whatever. So what's your thoughts on that?
Here you go.
I agree. First, the Senate is going to be a really, really difficult road to travel down for Democrats, to take back the Senate. And the Senate, of course, is crucial because Trump makes nominees to all the federal courts. And with 4 years, he will transform the federal courts. In terms of the 2026 congressional elections, I do think they're crucial. If Trump can do this, what he has done in the last 8 months, imagine what will be like 3.5 years from now if he has had control of the federal government, the executive branch, essentially the Supreme Court, functionally the Supreme Court, and the Congress for that entire time. Those 2026 elections are crucial. I have some suggestions in this. One is, some of it comes back to money, but it's not all about money. The second is support of the movement voter project. How many people here know about MVP? No. So, movement voter project is an organizing project, and it works in communities and it works in swing states, and it organizes people with people who live in the communities. And MVP was there before the last election. It will be in those. It is in those communities now, and it will amp up their efforts going into 2026. And it's all totally transparent. You can see exactly where they're working. This goes towards an organizing effort, person to person, one vote at a time. And it is a place. It's an organization I support because of that model, and I think it is really an effective model. So that I think turns on money in a couple ways, both of those suggestions, but they're different avenues that try to get you to the same place. In terms of volunteering specifically for campaigns, an interesting conversation with someone the other day who said, what are the 5 most important congressional races and where should I go in to help? So that's a great question, and I didn't have the answer at the time, but you will certainly have an answer within the next some number of months. So I think people literally can go. I think people living in the communities are more effective than people who come from outside, but I do think that if you go and live someplace for a while, hey, you can make a difference. And you know, we all have friends and relatives in various places. You look at your various kind of class lists or friendship lists or email lists or whatever, you know people in some of those places. And I think that using personal influence to make people aware of the importance of these elections it can't be understated. Look, we have local elections in which sometimes 25% of the people, voters, come into the polls or vote, and the congressional off-year elections have relatively small turnout compared to what happens in the presidential. If you can help get people to the polls, get people who are only marginally engaged and get them more engaged and more concerned and get them out to do this one act, which is to vote for preservation of their basic freedoms, that will make a difference. So, again, if this were easy, we wouldn't be asking the question. I appreciate the question. I think it is the question, and it was one of the questions that needs to be answered. And I think that any way that you can support a candidate, you know, we have for here, for example, there's some New York State congressional districts that will be in play. And if you've ever taken the trip, it's a lovely trip in the fall. You get to know the other passengers in the car. You have a good time. You go door to door. You get your instructions, and you feel like you've done something useful. And in this instance, where every congressional seat matters, if we haven't learned anything, if we've learned anything, it has to be that. I think if you can do something really important.
Anybody else?
So this question falls into the category of, can we really do this? And I'm asking about the birthright clause in the Constitution, which perhaps has been challenged in the past, or there have been murmurs on the side, but it seems, the language seems so clear. And I'm wondering if this case has gone through the lower courts, or is it just zeroing in right on the Supreme Court? How is that working? What is that about?
Okay, so the 14th Amendment says this. This is one of the post-Civil War amendments. 13th, 14th, 15th, the 13th abolishes involuntary servitude and slavery. 14th guarantees equal protection and due process. 15th is a guarantee of voting rights. 14th Amendment, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof is the exclusion for the foreign ambassadors and their children. That's what it's about. There's no question of that. So you take out that clause because it's not applicable to anyone but 2 or 3 families that may be here from foreign countries. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. For those justices on the Supreme Court who say, we want the words to mean what they say, how could this be clear? How? God's name, could this be clear? Really. The idea that birthright citizenship was clearly defined as a right as of 1898. The case involved a person of Chinese descent, and he came back to the country, and there was a dispute about whether he'd be allowed back in because his parents were not citizens, and the Supreme Court said emphatically, you are a citizen of the United States, you get to return. No question about it, and that decision, that opinion has been affirmed time and time and time and time again by the Supreme Court. The idea that there was no birthright citizenship was viewed correctly, in my opinion, as an outlier, as a totally far-fetched, crazy idea. Of course there's birthright citizenship. It couldn't be clearer from the words. It couldn't be clearer from the precedent. It just is not, it was just a far-fetched right-wing idea that somehow now is treated as if it's serious jurisprudence.
Who decides? Why
This case is going to the Supreme Court. It's already been to the Supreme Court once, and it went, but it didn't go to the Supreme Court on the issue of the substance of the question. It went on the basis, it went to the Supreme Court on the question of whether or not there could be a nationwide injunction.
Right.
And so the Supreme Court didn't decide the substantive issue, it decided a procedural issue. Because that's what it granted certiorari, that's review, what it granted review of. And it decided, no, there would not be nationwide injunctions. But what was clear is that although the federal court couldn't be issuing these preliminary nationwide injunctions, that the federal courts, of course, could consider class actions, nationwide class actions. Only lawyers could love this stuff, I understand. But that, and so in fact, within hours of the Supreme Court having decided that no, the nationwide injunctions will be vacated, nonetheless, there were class action lawsuits that were filed, and those cases are in fact continuing, and there are cases as well brought by states out on the West Coast. This is getting to the Supreme Court. There's no question about that. And I'll share my view. I think the Supreme Court, I go back to, you never know how these things are going to come out. But the Supreme Court, I think, has every reason to sustain birthright citizenship. Some of them is because you have precedent going back for a century and a quarter. Some of it, not that, as we know from overturning Roe versus Wade, this doesn't, 100 years or 50 years of precedent does not stand in the way of the Supreme Court coming to a decision that was predicted it would come to. But in this instance, I think it allows the court to look, kind of fair-handed. Look, this was a case we decided for you people with all that, speak for persons who have less advantages, and we came out your way. So what are you complaining about if we come out and say that, say again, or maybe you don't?
Instead, we can round them all up.
Yeah, and things like that, and because we gave all of this at the same time that the Supreme Court will give Trump enormous authority to impose his will on immigration law and ICE procedures. And when it comes to both foreign relations and immigration, in fact, the president has great authority. The Supreme Court's not going to have a lot of trouble, I fear, in saying, it depends on what the case and what the fact pattern is that goes up, but this Supreme Court's not going to have enormous trouble defending Trump's ability to impose his will on how immigration enforcement occurs in the United States. And I think that when it comes to birthright citizenship, given the overwhelming precedent against Trump's executive order, and the fact that many people believe that it is not only a constitutional right, but it's a clear constitutional right. It's been a clear constitutional right since 1898, actually since the 14th Amendment was passed, but that specific issue has been decided by the Supreme Court consistently since that time. And someone's going to say, well, they didn't decide exactly that issue since 1898 because it was decided in 1898, and just those cases that have come after it have followed it and said, yes, it's the law. Yeah, that's right. That's true. That said, I think that when this case gets to the court, my hope is that it will result in a decision that says birthright citizenship means what it says what it means, and there's not going to be a change in the law. It will be an important victory, and in some ways it will be the victory that will be used by the right against those who would see a more just world. It's a somewhat glass half full kind of, look, that decision comes out the right way, we're going to all celebrate. Let's be clear.
Okay.
Oh,
Any other questions, comments?
Right here.
Right there, and
Do people know about the indivisible group?
somebody wanted to speak on
There's all kinds of ways to help in there. Indivisible.org, check it out.
it. Thanks.
okay. And Indivisible Swing Left, Western Mass will be sponsoring the No King's Day rally in Northampton. I think go local, but should anyone be here from way down south, they will be sponsoring the No Kings event. And Springfield, thank you.
I have a question, Bill. What do you think of the resistant action of, let's say, that everyone in this room decides they're not going to pay federal taxes, and maybe even the Commonwealth of Massachusetts agrees that this is a good action and sets maybe they pay the federal taxes to the state and they keep it before sending it to the federal government. What do you think about that?
I have a right to remain silent. Everything I say can and will be used against us both. Look, this is the Randy Keeler situation.
Yes, well,
Are you ready to lose your house?
as a group, as residents of the Commonwealth, with the approval or with the guidance of the state, do you think, and not only Massachusetts, but maybe California, maybe some of the other states, the blue states, gathering and holding back federal money? I mean, I think that's something that we should be thinking about as a resistant movement. I know it's not legal, but maybe what is legal right now?
Okay, this is a complicated question, and people have to make very serious evaluations of how much risk they are willing to take for what kind of reward that they might achieve. And I don't want to be dismissive of it. I knew Randy. We helped represent him in part of that litigation. He and Betsy Corner are just fabulous, wonderful people, and his death, of course, was just heartbreaking. It's tax resistance is really difficult, and it needs to be something that's thought through. And you raised the question, well, if there are enough of us, aren't we safe? And to which I would ask you, how many is that?
Every blue state.
Every one in every blue state? Yeah, give us a sporting chance.
If you're willing to lose federal funding, perhaps.
Oh, yeah.
We already did.
Well,
No, you haven't. Medicare, Social Security.
yeah, I'm just saying, I understand the impetus and the motivation and the feelings behind it. This is not an easy path to trod. Yes?
So talking about how many is that we need, and you talked about is it Professor Chenoweth?
Yes, Erica Chenoweth, yes.
12%?
She said 3.5%.
3.5%, which is 12 million.
12 million people, approximately, yeah.
Now, my understanding, reading across after No King's Day 1, was that we had like 5 or 6 million across the country, which means that we need twice what we had out in the country.
Yeah, and some will say we really shouldn't count the kids and the certain, 3.5% is the statistics that she came up with. But yes, that was my analysis as well, which was No King's Day did not have that number, but it was close, depending on whose estimates you
I don't think we were close to 12 million, but I think it tells us we can't stop. We have to keep getting more and more people out and keep going ourselves.
Thank you.
And perhaps that's a good place for us to stop, unless somebody has a really pressing question. If not, I'd like to thank, oh, here we go.
Just a quickie, but I worry about anything that we, and not only we in this room, but all those in the country writ large, who are tying their hopes to working in an effective way to keep our democracy. The point is, we have a democracy. We have a democracy right now, and to use the term that is applied to Hungary, and I think it's an appropriate one, it's an illiberal democracy. But the point is that we've had elections, that in the last presidential election, Trump got the popular vote, he got the electoral college, and the people spoke, and he's now in office. And so the question is, what the hell do we do to change that?
Well, I don't have much more to add than what we've already been over. I have some disagreement with how much of a democracy we are. But we are more democratic than a lot of places, that's for sure. We are more representative government than many places. And I do have one answer to that that we have not gone over. And that is this old cliche, the bumper sticker of think globally and act locally. We have the ability in Massachusetts to offset a fair amount of what the federal government is doing. And we have an administration that in fact is devoted to doing that. Now, reality is, if the federal government cuts Medicaid massively, no state will be able to fill in that gap, no matter how well intended. That's just reality. But we are in fact devising all sorts of ways in the Commonwealth to mitigate the damage and to still remain a force for good and for energetic enterprises in the fields of medicine and science and technology. And I think that we have the opportunity to act locally that will in fact have an enormous impact, because if we are successful in Massachusetts, and we have some successes to point to, I think it will point the way for other places in the country. We have money that is going to education, notwithstanding what the federal government is doing, because we, the people of Massachusetts, passed a proposition that was going to require a surtax on income over $1 million a year, 4%. Okay, and it's resulted in close to $3 billion of tax revenues this year. It's going to go to education and transportation. Good for us. So I think there is a lot to do, and I think making our Commonwealth a model not only improves the lives of all of us who live here, but in fact moves the country in a direction that we think it should move in.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think that's a great note to end this on, and I want to thank you all for coming out, and I hope you'll come back for future presentations from the Whately Civic Association. They're in the works right now. The dates are a little fluid, so check twice before you drive all the way out here for another talk. But Bill, I want to thank you so much for coming out to our little town.
Well, this has been a terrific audience, really, just fabulous.